Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel HSE Consultant. My name is Engineer Abdul Wahab. As you know, we are having a series of HSE training. So today's topic for that series is risk assessment. In this presentation, we will discuss about the risk assessment, steps of the risk assessment and many more. But why the risk assessment is so important? Because the risk assessment helps the organization to identify the hazard and the risk in their workplaces and to evaluate the risk level and to decide the control measures to reduce those levels to the acceptable levels or to remove those risks from the workplace. On the basis of the risk assessment, the management can make the decisions. So the risk assessment is the backbone of any risk mitigation system or risk management system. So let's see what will be the learning outcomes of this presentation. In this presentation, we are going to discuss the risk assessment, types of risk assessment importance in risk management systems, risk assessment steps, hazard and risk identification, and who might be harmed. In the other parts, we were going to discuss the remaining risk assessment steps in the part number 3 and part number 4 and part number 5. So, inshallah, we will discuss the remaining risk assessment steps there in those parts. Let's see what is a risk assessment. Risk assessment is a systematic approach to identify the hazard, evaluating the risk associated with those hazards in the workplace, and implementing the reasonable control measures to remove or to reduce those risks up to the acceptable level. So, what are the types of the risk assessment? There are three major types of the risk assessment: qualitative risk assessment, semi-quantitative risk assessment, and quantitative risk assessment. The qualitative risk assessment is done where we are having a less knowledge about our system and we are going to use no mathematical or numerical values to identify the risk level. We are mostly using the words like low, medium, medium, and high. And in the semi-quantitative risk assessment, we are going to use the same words with some numerical values that are for the probability and the severity of the risk, and we can also call the risk factors that can be exposure, detection, and here we will have the wordings like low, medium, high, and as well as we are going to have some numerical values for this one. In the quantitative risk assessment, we are having the exact knowledge information about the process, and these are using for the complex systems as well. So quantitative risk assessment, there are many methods that are going to be used for the quantitative risk assessments, but even after the quantitative risk assessment, we are going to having some residual risk. The risk is not going to be eliminated 100% by the quantitative risk assessment. So these are the three types of the risk assessment: qualitative, semi-quantitative, and the quantitative risk assessment. Now we are going to have a glimpse of the risk assessment in the risk management system and occupational health and safety management system. As you can see in the risk management system, the risk assessment is the main part of the system. You can see here, before going towards the steps of the risk assessment, we have to establish the context of the risk assessment. What is the purpose of the risk assessment? What is the scope of the risk assessment? What we are going to assess? What are the activities that will be included? What are the methods that we will use? What will be the resources that will be consumed? What is the size of the team and the qualification and the expertise of the team that is going to assess that risk? So all that will be included in the context, as well as we will also go for the risk and hazard identification. Firstly, we will identify the hazard, then we will identify the risk that are associated with those hazards. Then we are going to analyze those risks, and we are going to find out the risk levels, and we are going to analyze the control measures if some of them is applicable at that time, and we are going to treat those risks according to the hierarchy of control. But in all these steps, the monitoring and review will go side by side in each step, as well as the communication and consultation will also go side by side. So here we can see that the risk assessment is having the main and major part of risk management system. Same likely here in occupational health and safety management system in PDCA cycle, we can see first we have to plan, then we have to implement and operate, then we have to go for checking and corrective action, then we have to go for the management review. By this one we can see that by a continuous process of the risk management, we can increase the satisfaction of our employees, we can reduce the hazard and the risk associated with those hazards. Also we can reduce the cost, direct and indirect cost of the incident and accident. We can also reduce the values, numbers of the incident and accident that are happening on our site. So by this one, our productivity will be increased and hazard, risk and their cost will be reduced. So it is a continuous process of analyzing the risk and then reducing the level of those risks to the acceptable level. Maybe that level that is acceptable at this time to us may not be acceptable in the next coming risk assessment. In this way, this is a continual improvement of the system. So let's see what are the steps of the risk assessment. The first step in the risk assessment is identification of hazard and risk. This we have already discussed in the previous presentations. The second is who might be harmed. The third is to evaluate the risk and decide on the precautions or control measures. The fourth one is record your finding and implement them. The fifth one is review statement and update if necessary. So all these steps of the risk assessment, we will go through this one. So we have another well explained risk assessment steps diagram that will help us to explain more all the risk assessment process. Here in this risk assessment process, you can see the first one is selection of the risk assessment matrix. The second one is establish the context. Third one is assemble team. Fourth one is identify hazard and risk. The fifth one is analyze risk. Sixth one is evaluate risk. Seventh is treat risk. Eighth is document. And the last one is monitor and review. Here we will discuss the selection of risk assessment with the evaluation of the risk. So let's start with the establish of the context. The risk assessment context should be clear and understandable to everybody. It should define the beginning and the end of the statement. It should not be too narrow that the hazard cannot be identified or associated risks with those hazards cannot be identified. And either it should not be so broad that it should detract our goals and the process of risk assessment. The risk assessment context must have the purpose and scope. It should include that what is the purpose and what is the scope of that risk assessment. If we are going to assess something, for example, we are going to assess a plant and we have to confirm this one, either the raw material is included or not included, either the product is included in risk assessment or not included. So it should be clear what will be the scope of risk assessment and why we are going to have the risk assessment. Also, it should be mentioned the size of the team, the members of the team, the qualification of the members, as well as the methodologies that will be used in the risk assessment, what will be the risk criteria, what are the sources that we are going to use in this risk assessment, and what are the risk levels, and what is our organization acceptable level. So this level will help us to decide to have the control measures. What are the control measures we will implement to reduce those risk levels to acceptable levels. And also, of course, last one is choose control measures. By this one we can choose for what level of risk which will be the control measures. So in this way, the risk assessment context will be written before going to the next step. Next is assemble the team. The team for the risk assessment should be cross-functional. It should be from management, from workers, from third party. For example, we are assessing some process. The team should comprise of operator, worker, electrical engineer, production engineer, mechanical engineer, as well as we can say some person from the top management, from laboratory, and maybe the third party, maybe our client persons should be there. Some people for this risk assessment team will be permanent, while other will be temporary. A facilitator must be deployed in that one. The facilitator will help us to communicate the risk assessment and the point with the other people, also with the management, with the workers, but as well as he will control and keep the risk assessment on track. He will also take the instructions and advice and point of view of all the members, but he will not impose his point of view on others. As same like this, he will also see, because some of the team members, they are influencing their point of view on the other's point of view, so he is going to nullify that effect. So the facilitator is having the main role in the risk assessment team. So risk assessment team mostly should be between 3 or 10. Less than 3 will not helpful to identify all the hazards and the risk associated in that risk assessment, while more than 10 will be so big team that their views cannot be concluded and maybe it can detract the risk assessment process. So we should have a team between 3 to 10, but the members of the team must have the knowledge of the activities as well as hazard identification and risk assessment. They should be experienced. They should have the skill to identify the hazard, to evaluate the hazard, to identify the control measures. They should know about the purpose and scope of risk assessment, and they should have some knowledge for the risk criteria. So assembling a good team will lead us to have a good risk assessment. The next is identifying the risk. How we can identify the risk? The risk identification can be dependent on different tools. The first one is brainstorming. The second is checklist. The third one is regulation, that can be OSHA, EPA, DOT, and also some industry standards we can read, check, ANSI, ASTM, and NEFPA. Some experts, they can help us to identify the risks. Also accidental records, insurance claim, job hazard analysis, and OSHA or injury illness record. All these tools, they can help us to identify the hazard. For simple system, we can identify the hazard with 1, 2, or 3 tools, but for the complex system, we have to combine more than 1 tools to identify the risks. So by identifying these risks, we can go further. So let's see what's the next. The next is who might be harmed. After identifying the risk, we have to consider that who might be harmed. Maybe these are the employers or the workers that are working there. Maybe some customers, some vendors, contractors, some new and young workers that are working in our plant or workplace, some disabled people that are working in our area or workplace. We have to consider the lone worker or migrant worker that they are working there. Maybe they don't know about the risk and hazards on that workplace. Also, we have to know about the expectant mothers if there is some in our workplace. We have to know about the temporary workers, our surrounding also, because the people in the surrounding, they may not know about the hazard and the risks that are in our workplace, and it may affect to them. So we have to know about each and every person who is going to be affected by the hazard and associated risk. That's all for this time. Thank you so much for watching our presentation, and the next coming presentation, the part number 3, part 4 and part 5 will conclude all the risk assessment and the steps and processes. For having the knowledge about all the risk assessment, you have to visit our part number 3, part number 4 and part number 5 of the risk assessment. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this presentation, kindly like, subscribe and share with your friends. Thank you so much.